What I've been asked to do is to say what we know about Islamic banks' positions on fintech in general, but open banking in particular. And a key source of our data here is the survey, the Global Islamic Banking Survey, which CIBAFI conducted and published in 2020. And one of the reasons that's a key data source is that its special theme was fintech adoption within Islamic banks. And overall, the survey had 101 respondents from 35 countries, though, to be fair, not all of them answered all the questions. It covered a substantial number of financial technologies. For this session, I'm going to have to try and focus down on the data relating specifically to open banking. Do read the rest of the survey, do ask questions about the rest of the survey to the Secretariat afterwards. But when they were asked about their implementation of fintech trends on a scale going from not at all to a very great extent, what we saw from the Islamic banks is what you see on this screen. Clearly, the technology that is being most seriously adopted, and that's unsurprising, is mobile banking and mobile payments. Everybody has got that on their minds. Just about everybody is trying to do it one way or another. But open banking comes relatively close behind. Yes, there are one or two other technologies which are getting similar levels of implementation, but clearly open banking is the next thing that people are worrying about. However, what you will notice there is that there is a degree of polarization. Although we have a very chunky number of banks implementing open banking either to a very great extent or to a substantial extent, we also have a substantial number who are not there at all. The other thing I will say about these data is that we can look at large banks and small banks separately. For open banking, as for most other technologies, the larger banks are stronger implementers than the smaller ones. Perhaps that's not a great surprise. Let's have a look at one of the reasons for the polarization, and it goes to what is actually happening in the jurisdiction, because open banking is something that tends to be implemented on a jurisdiction level. And Saudi Arabia have decided that they will implement, some other countries have not. When we look at what banks say their jurisdiction is doing, yes, about 20% say their jurisdiction has already introduced it, another 14% in the implementation stage. But there's a significant group who don't plan to introduce at all, and a very substantial number who are at the initial discussion stage. So perhaps it's not too surprising that what we see from the banks themselves is a bit polarized. The other thing I want to pick up from that survey is what the Islamic banks, where the Islamic banks say that change was needed for fintech adoption. And we offered them 6 possible options. Not surprisingly, they all scored quite high, but the leading problems for the banks were the technological skills of their employees, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later, customer awareness, and their own IT systems. And it's fairly clear that Islamic banks are in some places really struggling to change legacy IT systems. Now, fortunately, there is another take available to us on what Islamic banks are doing in open banking. within the past week, 10 days or so, the Islamic Financial Services Board published its working paper 19 on digitalization in Islamic banks. The questions were slightly different, but they overlapped significantly. And interestingly, although the two samples were commensurate in size, their distribution was very significantly different. The IFSB, perhaps surprisingly, got more than twice as many responses from the GCC, but very few from North Africa, and relatively few from the Middle East outside the GCC. So distinctly different sample distributions, which will explain some of the differences, but nevertheless, there are some quite similar results. The technological advances that the IFSB asked about were a little bit different. Nevertheless, they overlap. Again, unsurprisingly, mobile banking and digital wallets were right at the top of the list. That is what people are seriously thinking about, seriously doing. Biometric authentication, which we didn't ask about in CIBAFI, also scored high. So yes, our fingerprints and our iris patterns are being recognized. I'm sorry. But two other interesting points. Application programming interfaces were also scoring very high. And that, of course, is a necessary precondition, really, for open banking. But open banking capabilities themselves were rather lower. We're still talking about 60% of Islamic banks. That's a higher score than shown in the CIBAFI survey. We don't know, unfortunately, whether that is simply the fact that time had moved on by a year and that Islamic banks are getting behind open banking, or whether it's a difference in the sample. I also want to pick up from that survey the challenges to digital transformation. Again, there is a very significant overlap with what we saw in our own survey, because legacy infrastructure is once again scoring very high as a reason that is impeding change. But look near the bottom, look at what they said specifically about open banking. That a lack of national initiatives and architecture is an impediment for a really rather huge 57% of the Islamic banks. And human resources are also, unsurprisingly, a significant issue. Now, in the CIBAFI survey in particular, we allow substantial write-ins. So we have some information that is not simply statistical from the banks. What are the banks actually telling us? Well, they are saying that big challenges are, first, common standards and the interoperability of APIs. This is not really a surprise. Yes, you can use APIs as the basis for your software, but if you don't have common standards across the banks of your jurisdiction, you will not really be able to create an open banking environment in which switching is easy, in which other providers can operate off the bank systems. So common standards are the big issue, and this was echoed in the IFSB survey. Cybersecurity emerges in the CIBAFI survey as a major issue throughout, but certainly for open banking. Banks are really very afraid of opening their systems to other companies and to other points of contact. Data protection, it's a slightly different issue. Yes, one of the issues in data protection is, of course, whether the security of your data may be breached. But there is also the issue that open banking implies sharing customer data with other entities, and you just may not trust them as much to use the data properly as you trust yourselves. So a proper data protection environment is going to be a significant issue for the Islamic banks. I just finished by saying overall that the impression that I have from the write-ins is that many Islamic banks seem unprepared. Frankly, some of them would be happier if open banking would go away, and they will act only if and when their regulators tell them to. But on the other hand, there's a cadre of Islamic banks that are really supportive of open banking, but still want their regulators or some other entity, maybe the Banking Federation, to take a lead in their country to provide the standards that will make open banking possible. The fear I have is that the Islamic banking sector will be left behind. If some Islamic banks continue to bury their heads in the sand, then they may find that open banking is introduced, that the banks that can take advantage of it are the big ones, maybe even the global ones. And unfortunately, at the moment, those are dominantly conventional banks. Islamic banks are in general rather smaller than their competitors. In that circumstance, there is a real risk that they will be left behind. That would be a pity, because open banking should be an opportunity for them to reach more customers. They have, after all, a unique selling proposition, which is Sharia compliance, and therefore meeting the religious principles of many of their customers. But all the evidence suggests that customers will not, given a choice, take Islamic banking at any cost. They will take it if it offers comparable convenience, cost, all the other things. Islamic banking needs, if it is to maintain that unique selling proposition, to be at the forefront of open banking, not simply trailing the conventional sector. So, thank you, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.